On that early spring morning in the Wesel sector of Germany, as the first light began to penetrate the darkness of what would become March 24, 1945, a German general stood trembling at his observation post. Erich Febig had commanded troops for 3 decades, had witnessed the full spectrum of military operations that modern warfare could produce, yet nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he was seeing through his field glasses as he swept them across the western skyline. The heavens themselves appeared to be moving, transformed into something that defied his understanding of what was militarily possible. Years afterward, when historians would discover his personal writings archived in the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv, they would read his attempt to describe the indescribable. He compared it to witnessing entire divisions being distributed from the sky, with the casual efficiency of a newspaper delivery service, calling it industrial sorcery rather than conventional warfare. What unfolded during those morning hours would become the largest airborne assault ever conducted in a single day, with over 16,000 paratroopers descending onto the eastern banks of the Rhine River in the vicinity of Wesel and Hamminkel. The German soldiers who survived to witness this spectacle would have their entire conception of military logistics shattered beyond repair. They were watching the Americans and British demonstrate that warfare itself could be industrialized, that entire armies could be delivered through the air with the same systematic efficiency that characterized Henry Ford's automobile production lines. This was the psychological destruction they experienced, and it had actually begun its work on their minds 3 weeks before this massive airborne operation took place. The impossible had already happened once, back on March 7, 1945. A young officer named Karl Timmermann, who had been born in Frankfurt but now fought wearing an American uniform, had led the advance elements of the 9th Armoured Division to accomplish something that German High Command initially refused to accept as reality. They had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen without it being destroyed, taking it intact. When the first reports came through to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters, his chief of staff, who held the rank of General Major and was named Karl Wegener, simply could not believe what he was being told. He would later provide testimony at Nuremberg, describing how they assumed the reports were nothing more than enemy propaganda, because the speed of advance seemed impossible. The success of such an assault without extensive preparation seemed beyond credibility. Yet within a matter of hours, American forces were crossing that bridge in such numbers that Wegener compared it to water pouring through a dam that had been broken open. The Ludendorff Bridge had been constructed during the First World War using Russian prisoners as labour, and the Germans had prepared it for demolition with 2,800 kilograms of explosive charges wired throughout its structure. When the moment came and German engineers triggered the detonation, the explosives failed to perform as intended. Only a partial detonation occurred because the Donnerite explosives they had been forced to use were civilian grade, far weaker than military specifications. The bridge would eventually collapse 10 days later from the accumulated damage it had sustained, and when it fell, 28 American engineers would die and 93 more would be injured. But by the time the bridge collapsed, its destruction had become strategically meaningless. The Americans had already accomplished something that every principle of German military doctrine stated was impossible to achieve. An engineer officer serving with Army Group B kept meticulous technical notes throughout this period. This officer, Hans-Georg Model, happened to be the son of Field Marshal Walter Model, and his observations survived the war to provide detailed insight into how German professionals viewed what they were witnessing. On March 15th, he watched American engineers assembling what he could only describe as looking like a massive erector set spanning the Rhine. In his notes, he marvelled at how the Americans and British possessed bridge components that assembled like children's toys. This was the Bailey Bridge, and its inventor was a British engineer named Donald Bailey, who had developed his design while tinkering with model bridges as a hobby before the war began. The revolutionary aspect of the Bailey Bridge was that it required no specialised tools or heavy equipment for assembly. Each component was light enough to be carried in standard trucks and could be lifted into place by hand, yet the finished structure was strong enough to support 60-ton tanks rolling across it. Models' notes emphasized how every single piece was interchangeable with every other piece of its type. The German General Staff had never encountered such a concept in military engineering. When German commanders had planned their Rhine defense strategy, they had made calculations based on what they believed were the limitations of Allied airborne capabilities. General Oberst Alfred Schlemm commanded the 1st Parachute Army, and he had assured his staff with complete confidence that any Allied airborne operation would be limited in scope, perhaps a brigade or at most 2 brigades. He had told them flatly that the Allies lacked the transport capacity for anything larger. German intelligence had estimated that approximately 7,000 infantry would be defending the Rhine crossing area. The reality that was about to unfold would be so far beyond these estimates that it would have a devastating effect on German morale. As night turned toward morning on March 23rd, Allied artillery began the preparatory bombardment for what had been designated Operation Plunder. German forward observers began reporting something that seemed to make no sense. 4,000 Allied guns had opened fire at exactly the same moment, creating what appeared to be a solid wall constructed of steel and high explosive that turned the darkness into blazing daylight. The intensity of this barrage was so extreme that German soldiers positioned 30 kilometers away from the impact zone could feel continuous trembling in the ground beneath their feet for 4 solid hours. Windows shattered in villages located 40 kilometers from where the shells were falling. It was as if the Allies were reshaping the terrain itself through the application of explosive force. When the clock reached precisely 7 in the morning on March 24th, the sky became filled with an armada of aircraft that seemed to defy all reason. British forces had committed 322 transport planes carrying 3,837 paratroopers who had taken off from bases located in East Anglia. At the same moment, 298 American transport planes were lifting off from airfields in the area around Paris, and these planes carried 4,890 paratroopers belonging to the 17th Airborne Division. Following behind this first wave came the gliders. 906 American Waco gliders carried 4,810 soldiers, along with their vehicles, artillery pieces, and even light tanks. The British contribution added another 440 gliders of the Horsa and Hamilcar types to this aerial invasion force. German defenders found themselves paralysed by the sight. An Obergefreiter named Johann Becker, who served with the 84th Division, would later provide testimony about what he and his comrades experienced. They had seen large formations of aircraft before, had witnessed 100-plane bombing raids, but this was fundamentally different from anything in their previous experience. The sky turned black with the sheer number of aircraft. Transport planes, gliders, fighters, bombers, all flying together in an endless stream that seemed as if the entire aviation industries of America and Britain had taken to the air simultaneously. Some men simply sat down where they stood and stared upward. Others threw their weapons away, because what was the point of fighting when the sky itself had become the enemy? An Oberst named Wilhelm von Steuben commanded an anti-aircraft regiment positioned near Wessel, and he faced a tactical problem that had no solution. His regiment had been equipped with 114 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 712 light anti-aircraft guns positioned around the expected drop zones. This was the largest concentration of anti-aircraft defences that the Wehrmacht had managed to assemble since they had begun defending Berlin, yet it was completely meaningless against the scale of what was approaching. Von Steuben would later write in his memoir about how they had been told repeatedly that the Allies lacked sufficient transport aircraft, that fuel shortages would necessarily limit the size of any airborne operation. Yet what came at them was a force in numbers that literally darkened the sky. The airlift operation consisted of 541 transport aircraft and over 1,300 glider and tug aircraft combined. His gunners stood transfixed, forgetting their training and simply staring at this demonstration of seemingly infinite resources. When they did remember to fire, it was comparable to shooting arrows at a thunderstorm. They might hit individual drops of rain, but the storm continued regardless of their efforts. The Allies had calculated German anti-aircraft capabilities with the precision of actuaries calculating insurance risks. They knew exactly how many aircraft the German guns could theoretically engage given their positions and ammunition supplies. Their response was to send 3 times that number of aircraft. Additionally, they had conducted massive suppression operations using fighter bombers in the hours before the transport aircraft arrived, cratering gun positions and destroying ammunition stockpiles. When German guns did manage to fire, they faced an impossible choice. They could engage the transport planes and be destroyed by the fighter escorts, or they could engage the fighters and watch the transports deliver their cargo without interference. The gliders themselves represented a revolution in military logistics that no German commander had anticipated or prepared defensive measures against. The British Hamilcar gliders were the giants of the assault force, and they carried M22 Locust tanks that had been specially designed for airborne operations. These tanks weighed just 6.7 tons and had armour only 12.5 millimeters thick, but they carried gyro-stabilized 37mm guns that could immediately engage German positions the moment they landed. German doctrine, which had been developed based on years of actual combat experience, held definitively and without question that tanks could not be delivered by air. Yet here they were, dropping from the sky like steel rain falling on German positions. General Major Eugen Meindl was one of Germany's most experienced paratroop commanders and had been a pioneer in the development of airborne warfare techniques. He watched the operation unfold from his command post located 10 kilometers from the drop zones. His reaction, which was recorded by his aide-de-camp, was one of professional devastation. He noted that Germany had invented airborne warfare, had demonstrated it to the world at Rotterdam, at Eben Emael, at Crete. They had written the textbook on airborne operations. But what he was witnessing bore no resemblance to anything in that textbook. This was not military art as he understood it. This was industrial brutality. The Allies had manufactured an airborne assault with the same systematic approach that Krupp used to manufacture steel or that I.G. Farben used to manufacture chemicals. Quantity had achieved its own quality through sheer overwhelming mass. The speed with which the operation proceeded shattered every assumption that had been built into German military doctrine. German defensive planning, which had been refined through 5 years of continuous warfare, assumed that any airborne force would require at least 24 hours to consolidate after landing. This assumption was based on their own experiences and observations from Crete, from Sicily, from Normandy. Scattered drops, confused units, lost equipment. These were considered to be inevitable aspects of the friction that characterized airborne operations. The Allies had solved these problems through the application of overwhelming mass combined with meticulous planning that accounted for every variable. Unlike Operation Market Garden, which had taken place 6 months earlier and where drops had been spread over multiple days across 60 miles of territory, the entire Operation Varsity Force was delivered simultaneously in a single lift, concentrated in an area measuring just 5 miles by 6 miles. Within 3 hours of the first parachute's opening, Allied airborne forces had secured all of their primary objectives. German counterattack forces, which had been assembled based on the assumption that they would have 24 hours to organize, arrived to find fortified positions already established, anti-tank guns already in place, and the airborne forces already beginning offensive operations of their own rather than still consolidating defensively. But it was the bridges that truly broke German morale beyond any hope of recovery. Within hours of securing the initial bridgeheads, Allied engineers began constructing Bailey bridges with unprecedented speed that seemed to mock everything German engineers knew about bridge construction timelines. The Bailey Bridge system was a masterpiece of engineering that had been reduced to its simplest possible form. Every single piece was interchangeable, every joint was identical, every panel could connect to every other panel. No piece was unique or required special handling. No specialized skills were required beyond the basic training that any combat engineer received. At Rees, located 25 kilometres north of Wessel, the Royal Canadian Engineers began constructing what would be designated Blackfriars Bridge on March 26th. The bridge would eventually stretch 1,803 feet across the Rhine, making it the longest Bailey Bridge that had been built anywhere up to that point in history. German observers watched in complete disbelief as the bridge grew at a rate of 700 feet per hour. 227 truckloads of bridging equipment arrived in perfect sequence, each truck knowing exactly where to go and what to unload. 9,500 man-hours of labour were organised with such efficiency that no worker stood idle for more than a few seconds at any given time. After the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th, killing those 28 American engineers, US forces had simply shifted their operations to other crossing points without any apparent disruption to their overall timeline. Within hours, they had completed a treadway bridge 600 metres downstream from the collapsed structure. Within days, a pontoon bridge appeared, then a Bailey Bridge, then another Bailey Bridge, and another, and yet another. The Rhine River, which had protected Germany for 2,000 years, which had stopped Caesar's legions and Napoleon's armies, was being crossed as casually as if it were a village stream presenting no obstacle whatsoever. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel was one of Germany's most successful armoured commanders, and he visited the front lines on March 25th. His report back to Field Marshal Model was stark in its assessment. The Americans had made bridging into a mathematical problem with a predetermined solution. While German engineers calculated each timber, measured each span, considered each load with careful attention to unique circumstances, the Americans simply trucked in prefabricated sections and connected them according to formulas that had been worked out in advance. The Bailey Bridge could be modified for different lengths and load-bearing requirements without changing any of the basic components. Single configuration for light loads, double for medium loads, triple for the heaviest tanks. The Americans had removed the art from engineering and replaced it with simple multiplication. The psychological collapse among German troops was accelerating with each passing hour. Units that had fought tenaciously for months began surrendering en masse without significant resistance. The 2nd Parachute Regiment, which consisted of elite troops who had participated in the jump on Crete, simply laid down their arms when confronted with the reality of what they were facing. These were not cowards. They were professional soldiers who had recognized the complete futility of continued resistance. They had watched the sky fill with aircraft beyond counting, had seen bridges appear overnight where there had been nothing, had observed unlimited supplies being delivered by air. Resistance seemed not just futile, but absurd given the circumstances. On the afternoon of March 24th, after the airborne forces had been on the ground for less than 8 hours, 240 American B-24 Liberator bombers appeared at an altitude of 400 feet. They were not conducting a bombing mission. They were delivering supplies. 600 tons of supplies dropped by parachute directly to the airborne forces who were still in active combat. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, even replacement weapons. German logistics officers made calculations and determined that this single supply drop exceeded what an entire German corps might receive in a month of sustained combat operations. When Field Marshal Model received confirmation that the Allies had dropped 2 complete divisions in a single morning, with more troops arriving by glider every hour, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. Then he said that the war was truly lost. They were not fighting armies in any traditional sense. They were fighting the entire productive capacity of America brought to bear on military problems. The integration of airborne and ground forces proceeded with clockwork precision that German doctrine stated was impossible to achieve. By the afternoon of March 24th, less than 8 hours after the first parachute had opened, the British 15th Scottish Division had successfully linked up with both airborne divisions. Ground forces that had crossed the Rhine in assault boats during the night were shaking hands with paratroopers who had landed that same morning. German military theory, which had been based on hard-won experience at Crete, where German paratroopers had taken days to become combat effective after landing, held that airborne forces would require at least 48 hours to organize themselves into coherent fighting units after landing. The Allied forces were combat effective within hours of landing, some units within minutes of touching down. The C-46 Commando aircraft employed in Operation Varsity represented another level of American adaptation to the requirements of airborne warfare. These aircraft could carry 36 paratroopers, an entire platoon compared to only 18 in the older C-47 aircraft. German Junkers Ju-52 transports, which had been in service since the Spanish Civil War, could carry only 18 paratroopers maximum. The Americans were delivering airborne forces at double the rate that Germany had ever achieved, even at the absolute height of German airborne operations in 1941. However, the C-46 had a fatal flaw that revealed something about American attitudes toward warfare that was almost as shocking as the scale of resources being employed. The aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. When struck by anti-aircraft fire, they burst into flames immediately. 19 of 72 C-46 aircraft were lost on March 24th, with 14 of them burning in mid-air while paratroopers were still aboard waiting to jump. Yet the operation continued without any pause whatsoever. The Americans had calculated probable losses in advance and had sent enough aircraft to absorb those losses and still complete the mission. They treated human tragedy as a statistical probability, as acceptable losses in an industrial equation that had been solved before the operation even began. The variety of specialized equipment arriving by glider stunned German professionals, who understood that each type of specialized equipment represented years of development, extensive testing, and massive investment of resources. Germany had prototypes and concepts for similar equipment. The Allies had production lines churning out hundreds of each type as if they were ordinary consumer goods. When the Luftwaffe attempted to interfere with Operation Varsity, the results were catastrophic for the German forces. They had managed to assemble 375 single-engine fighters, 260 twin-engine fighters, and 40 of their precious Messerschmitt Me 262 jets for what they hoped would be a decisive intervention. They managed to shoot down 56 Allied aircraft, including 21 transport planes. But the Allies had sent over 3,000 aircraft in total. The loss rate was less than 2%. The Allies simply absorbed these losses and continued operations without any visible impact on the mission's success. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who had served as General der Jagdflieger and was Germany's most famous fighter commander, observed the operation from a position near Münster. His assessment was bleak. They could see the Allied formations coming from 50 kilometers away, thousands of aircraft in perfect formation, flying as if on parade. The Luftwaffe had perhaps 30 operational fighters in the entire sector. He compared their efforts to throwing pebbles at an avalanche. The Allies did not even alter their course when German fighters attacked. They simply continued their mission, accepting losses as a cost of doing business. The human cost was real and substantial, but it was treated with an industrial detachment that shocked German observers. The 17th Airborne Division suffered 159 killed, 522 wounded, and 840 missing in action on the first day alone. The British 6th Airborne Division suffered similar casualty rates. Combined, over 2,000 Allied airborne soldiers became casualties on March 24th. Yet these losses, which would have completely destroyed German airborne capability for months and required extensive reconstitution, were absorbed by the Allies without affecting their operational tempo in any way. Reserve units were already prepared and waiting. Replacement equipment was already loaded and ready for delivery. The machine simply continued without pause. The German elite units fared even worse by comparison to what they were witnessing. The 7th and 8th Fallschirmjäger divisions, which were Germany's premier paratrooper formations that had executed the famous assault on Crete, had been reduced through months of grinding combat to barely 900 men each. From their defensive positions, they watched as the Allies dropped 20 times their total number in a single morning. These were not elite troops who had been carefully selected and trained for years. Many of the American paratroopers had been civilians just 18 months earlier. Yet they descended from the sky in such overwhelming numbers that individual quality became irrelevant to the outcome. The bridges kept appearing with mechanical regularity that seemed to mock the very concept of the Rhine as a defensive barrier. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion, working with assistance from additional units, built a 1,258-foot floating Bailey Bridge at Remagen in less than 2 days, finishing at 7:15 in the morning on March 20th. German engineers calculated that such a bridge should require at least 2 weeks to construct, even with experienced crews working under ideal conditions. The Americans accomplished it using soldiers who had been civilians only a year earlier. At Bad Honigen, 9 kilometers upstream from Remagen, the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion constructed another tactical bridge on March 22nd. At Wallach, the 17th Armoured Engineer Battalion built a heavy pontoon bridge capable of carrying the heaviest tanks in the Allied inventory. At Rheinberg, another Bailey Bridge appeared. At Buderich, a railroad bridge was rapidly converted for vehicle traffic. Each bridge appeared faster than the previous one as engineers refined their procedures through repetition, turning construction into pure process that could be executed with minimal thought. The medical support that accompanied the airborne operation demonstrated yet another dimension of Allied superiority that German forces could no longer match. Field hospitals were dropped by glider with the initial assault waves. Operating theatres, X-ray machines, blood banks, and pharmaceutical supplies that German frontline units had not seen since 1942 were being delivered by air to forces actively engaged in combat. Penicillin, the miracle drug that German medical officers knew existed, but which Germany could not produce in meaningful quantities, was distributed freely to Allied wounded. Morphine was abundant rather than carefully rationed. Plasma was available by the litre rather than by the precious dose. Communication systems represented yet another gulf between the two militaries that had grown so wide it could not be bridged. Radio sets arrived by the hundreds. Telephone wire came in by the thousands of meters. Signal equipment of every type was available in quantities that German forces could never hope to match. The Allies had achieved something that German signal officers had considered theoretically impossible. They had established reliable communication between the airborne forces and supporting artillery from the very moment of landing. German forces, meanwhile, often relied on runners carrying messages on foot and signal flags for communication, methods that had remained essentially unchanged since the First World War. The 2 airborne divisions involved in Operation Varsity succeeded in capturing approximately 3,000 German soldiers while suffering roughly 2,000 casualties themselves. Many of the Germans who surrendered did so not out of cowardice, but from a rational recognition of the complete futility of continued resistance. They had watched the sky fill with more aircraft than they had ever imagined existed. They had seen bridges appear overnight where engineers said it was impossible. They had observed unlimited supplies being delivered by air as if logistics was no longer a constraint on operations. Resistance in the face of such overwhelming material superiority seemed not just futile, but absurd. By March 27th, just 3 days after the initial airborne assault, the Allied bridgehead had grown to 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. German doctrine called for immediate and aggressive counterattacks to eliminate bridgeheads before they could consolidate into defensible positions. But the Allies were consolidating faster than German forces could concentrate sufficient strength for effective counterattacks. By the end of March, all 4 United States armies fighting in Western Europe had crossed the Rhine. The First Army under the command of Courtney Hodges, the Third Army under George Patton, the 9th Army under William Simpson, and the 15th Army under Leonard Gero. Each crossing was supported by the same systematic application of overwhelming resources that had characterized Operation Varsity. On March 30th, Field Marshal Walter Model held what would be his last staff conference at his headquarters in the Ruhr Pocket. According to testimony from his Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagner, Model addressed his officers with brutal honesty. He told them that they had witnessed the future of warfare and that Germany was not part of that future. The Americans had made war into a problem of production management. They scheduled battles like train timetables. They delivered armies like cargo shipments. They built bridges like automobiles rolling off assembly lines. They were all watching not just the death of the Wehrmacht, but the death of war as they had understood it throughout their entire careers. Model issued his final order dissolving Army Group B on April 15, 1945. 6 days later, on April 21st, rather than accept surrender, he walked alone into a forest near Duisburg and took his own life with his service pistol. His last written words stated that the enemy's material superiority had become overwhelming, that further resistance was futile and would only lead to unnecessary deaths. It was an epitaph not just for a single army, but for an entire conception of how warfare was supposed to be conducted. By April 10th, even before Model had issued his final order, Army Group B had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr Pocket, representing the largest capitulation of German forces anywhere in the entire war. Many of these men had not been defeated in traditional battle. They had simply arrived at the rational recognition that fighting an enemy with apparently unlimited resources was pointless. The bridges remained standing after the war ended, serving as monuments to American industrial methodology applied to military problems. German engineer officers, now prisoners of war, were sometimes employed to help dismantle these structures. Each bridge they took apart was identical to every other bridge of its type. Each joint was perfect. Each span was precise. They stood as symbols of a fundamentally new kind of warfare, where victory was determined not on battlefields by soldiers, but in factories by production workers. Not by the decisions of generals, but by the efficiency of production managers. General Franz Halder, who had served as the former chief of the General Staff, was commissioned to conduct a post-war study of Allied bridging operations for the United States Army Historical Division. His conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The Allied bridge-building capacity represented the ultimate expression of industrial warfare applied to military operations. The Allies had not outfought the Wehrmacht in any traditional military sense. They had outproduced Germany to such an extent that military skill became largely irrelevant. They had turned the Rhine from Germany's shield, which had protected the nation for millennia, into merely another production problem to be solved through the systematic application of standardized processes. In 1950, General Oberst Kurt Student, who had founded the German airborne forces and had personally planned and executed the attacks on Eben Emael and Crete that had revolutionized warfare, wrote a final assessment of Operation Varsity. His words captured the psychological devastation that German military professionals had experienced. He acknowledged that Germany had created airborne warfare at Eben Emael in 1940. They had perfected those techniques at Crete in 1941. The Americans and British had industrialized airborne warfare over the Rhine in 1945. They had taken German innovation and made it routine. They had transformed the extraordinary into the ordinary through the application of mass production techniques. That, Student concluded, was how the Allies had won the war. Not through superior tactics or strategy in any traditional sense, but through the ability to mass-produce military solutions to problems that Germans still thought required creative genius to solve. The German officers who personally witnessed Operation Varsity and the Rhine crossings never psychologically recovered from the impact of what they had seen. They had witnessed warfare being transformed from a contest of will and skill into a problem of production management that could be solved through systematic processes. In a single day, the Allies had dropped more paratroopers into combat than Germany had employed in airborne operations during the entire war. They had built bridges faster than Germany could possibly destroy them. They had made the impossible into routine through the systematic application of overwhelming resources. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 marked far more than a military defeat for Germany in any conventional sense. They represented the complete psychological demolition of the German officer corps' entire worldview about how warfare was supposed to function. Everything they believed about warfare, about rivers serving as natural barriers, about the inherent limitations of airborne forces, about the importance of operational art and military genius, all of it was shattered by the overwhelming application of productive capacity to military problems that they had thought required creative solutions. In the final analysis, German military leaders had never imagined that American engineers would construct bridges overnight and drop entire divisions from the sky as routine operations because they had never conceived of warfare as fundamentally a production problem. They had prepared for battles in the traditional sense and instead found themselves confronting assembly lines. They had trained throughout their careers for war as they understood it based on centuries of military tradition, only to discover that America had changed the very definition of war itself into something unrecognizable. The bridges that stood across the Rhine served as monuments, not to military genius or to the courage of individual soldiers, but to industrial methodology, to systematic planning, and to mass production capabilities. They had not been built by warriors in any traditional sense, but by engineers following standardized procedures with interchangeable parts that required no special skill to assemble. And in that fundamental transformation lay both the immediate cause of Germany's defeat and the future of warfare itself, forever changed from an art that required genius and courage to a science that required only sufficient productive capacity and systematic procedures that could be taught to anyone. The German commanders, men who had spent their entire adult lives mastering what they believed was the art of war, discovered during those terrible days of March 1945 that the art they had mastered had become obsolete while they watched. Production had won the contest. The factory had defeated the battlefield. Mass output had triumphed completely over military tradition that stretched back centuries. The bridges still stood when the war ended 6 weeks later. They were perfect in their uniformity, absolutely identical in their construction, regardless of where they had been built. They served as monuments to a new age where wars would be won not by producing better soldiers, but by building better factories, not by demonstrating superior courage, but by achieving superior production rates, not by cultivating military genius, but by organizing industrial capacity efficiently. The bridges represented far more than simple river crossings. They were bridges from one era of warfare to another, from the age of warriors who were expected to win through skill and courage to the age of production lines where victory was determined by whoever could manufacture more equipment faster and deliver it to the battlefield more efficiently than their opponent could match.